The helicopter banks low over a stretch of central Texas brushland 50 feet off the ground, moving close to 65 miles an hour, and for a few seconds, the only sound on the recovered footage is rotor wash and wind. Then the gunner opens up. What follows is less than 4 minutes of recorded footage. But by the time the aircraft pulls back up to altitude and circles for a second pass, more than 30 animals are dead on the ground below. The pilot radios in a body count. The crew refuels, rearms, and goes back out before noon. This is not a rare event. It happens, in some form, on a near-daily basis across the state of Texas, sanctioned by state law, operated by licensed commercial outfits, and increasingly filmed and uploaded for an audience that treats it as entertainment. The targets are feral hogs. And the footage, viewed in isolation, looks like exactly what the headlines call it: a massacre, methodical and overwhelming, the kind of imagery that looks like it should be the end of the story. It isn't. Because when researchers, wildlife biologists, and public health officials started tracking what actually happens in the weeks and months after these operations end, what happens to the animals left behind, what happens to the population numbers on paper, and what happens to the carcasses scattered across the brush once the helicopter is gone, what they found was not the clean resolution that the footage implies. It was something stranger, and in some ways more unsettling than the cull itself. To understand why, you first have to understand exactly how Texas got to the point where shooting wild animals from a helicopter became not just legal, but a thriving commercial industry. Feral hogs are not native to Texas, or to North America at all. They descend from domestic pigs brought over by early European settlers, later interbred with Eurasian wild boar that were deliberately introduced in some regions for sport hunting in the early 20th century. Whatever their exact ancestry, the hybrid that resulted turned out to be one of the most successful invasive mammals ever to establish itself on the continent. They are intelligent, adaptable, omnivorous, and almost entirely without natural predators large enough or numerous enough to meaningfully check their numbers in most of the state. And their reproductive biology is, by any standard measure of mammalian fertility, extreme. A female feral hog can reach sexual maturity at 6 to 8 months old. Her gestation period lasts roughly 3 months, 3 weeks, and 3 days. She can produce more than 1 litter per year, with litter sizes commonly running between 4 and 6 piglets, and under favorable conditions, considerably more. Texas Parks and Wildlife Department estimates put the current statewide population somewhere in the range of 2.5 to over 6 million animals, present in 253 of the state's 254 counties, every county except one. The damage they cause is not abstract or marginal. Feral hogs root through soil searching for grubs, roots, and bulbs, tearing up pasture land, crop fields, and native habitat in the process, destroying the root systems of plants and accelerating erosion. They wallow in and contaminate creeks, ponds, and other water sources. They compete directly with native wildlife for food and territory, and they prey opportunistically on ground-nesting birds, including species of conservation concern. The financial toll across Texas alone has been estimated at hundreds of millions of dollars annually in crop losses, pasture damage, and control costs, contributing to a national total that researchers now place above $1.5 billion a year. This is the backdrop against which Texas in 2011 passed legislation legalizing the aerial shooting of feral hogs from helicopters, a practice that, under federal law, is otherwise restricted by the Airborne Hunting Act, with specific carve-outs for depredation management of exactly this kind. 8 years later, in 2019, the state went further, eliminating the requirement for a hunting license to take feral hogs on private property with landowner permission, opening the activity to a much broader market, including hunters with no Texas residency, and, for some outfitters, no prior firearms experience at all. What followed was the rapid growth of a now well-established commercial industry, with operators offering packages ranging from roughly $5,000 to $9,000 per person, flying clients, and stabilized helicopters equipped with AR platform rifles, and in some cases offering access to fully automatic weapons and infrared imaging for night operations. The marketing language used by these outfitters is unambiguous about what the experience is actually selling: adrenaline, spectacle, and a body count, framed as a public service. And by certain narrow measures, the practice is genuinely effective. Research conducted by Texas wildlife agencies has found that a single aerial gunning flight can remove approximately 31% of the feral hog population present in a given area, with subsequent flights over the same territory increasing that figure to 56% and then 67%, as crews return to the same properties. Individual outfitters report similarly striking single-day numbers, dozens of animals removed in a few hours of flight time, sometimes accompanied by specific case studies showing dramatic short-term reductions in rooting damage on individual properties immediately following an operation. This is the part of the story that the footage captures, and it is the part that ends up online, framed as decisive victory. It is also, according to the population data that wildlife researchers have spent over a decade compiling, deeply misleading about what is actually happening to the feral hog population as a whole. Here's the number that genuinely surprises most people who encounter it for the first time, including a fair number of landowners who have spent thousands of dollars on aerial removal services, believing they were meaningfully solving their hog problem. Texas A&M AgriLife Extension's population modeling, based on the documented reproductive rate of feral hogs and field data on actual removal rates across the state, concluded that wildlife managers would need to remove somewhere between 66 and 75% of the entire statewide feral hog population every single year, indefinitely, just to hold the population stable at its current size. Not to reduce it, just to keep it from growing any further. The same modeling found that the actual statewide harvest rate, accounting for every method combined, including aerial gunning, trapping, ground hunting, and snaring, was somewhere closer to 29% annually. That gap between 29% and the 66 to 75% threshold required for stabilization is the entire story hiding underneath the footage of every successful-looking aerial cull. A helicopter crew killing 30 hogs in an afternoon, removing 67% of the hogs present on one specific ranch over multiple sorties, is by every visible measure an enormous, decisive success. And, at the same time, viewed against the actual reproductive output of the surviving population across the rest of the state, it barely moves the needle. Research from the University of Georgia's Savannah River Ecology Laboratory, studying sustained intensive removal efforts in the southeastern United States, did find that consistent multi-method control programs, sustained over 24 months, were capable of achieving roughly a 70% reduction in local pig abundance, alongside a corresponding 99% decline in measurable rooting damage, proof that the math can work under ideal, sustained, well-funded conditions. But achieving and sustaining that level of removal across the entire landmass of Texas year after year against a population reproducing at the rate feral hogs reproduce has so far remained functionally impossible. The footage shows a massacre. The state-level data shows something closer to a population that, despite an enormous and growing industry built specifically around killing it, has continued expanding for decades. That is the first part of the aftermath nobody quite expects when they search out this footage looking for a satisfying resolution. The second part is what happens, physically, to the animals left on the ground after the helicopter departs. Aerial gunning operations are not typically followed by full carcass recovery. Across large tracts of remote or difficult terrain, precisely the kind of property where aerial control is most commonly deployed, because ground access is limited, the dead hogs are simply left where they fall. This is standard practice, acknowledged openly by wildlife management guidance and outfitters alike, and on its own it might seem like a minor logistical footnote. It is not, because feral hogs, as a species, carry a documented and significant disease burden, and the carcasses left behind after a large-scale removal event do not simply decompose in isolation. They become a sudden, concentrated food source for every scavenger species within range. Historical surveillance data compiled by the Texas Animal Health Commission indicates that approximately 10% of feral swine statewide test positive for swine brucellosis, a bacterial disease that can spread to cattle, causing abortion and illness, and that is zoonotic, transmissible to humans, typically through direct contact with blood, reproductive fluids, or undercooked meat, producing chronic flu-like symptoms that can escalate to arthritis or meningitis in severe cases. A further estimated 20% of the feral swine population carries pseudorabies, a herpes virus unrelated to actual rabies despite the name, which does not infect humans but is frequently lethal in other mammals, including domestic dogs, that come into close contact with infected hogs or their carcasses. This is not a theoretical risk. Documented case reports from wildlife disease researchers describe hunting dogs in Alabama and Arkansas contracting pseudorabies after direct contact with feral swine during hunts, developing severe facial swelling, uncontrollable itching, and self-inflicted trauma from scratching, with the disease typically proving fatal within 48 hours of symptom onset. Wildlife health officials explicitly flag scavengers and predators as an additional, less studied transmission pathway, animals that feed on an infected carcass left in the field, whether coyotes, bobcats, vultures, or other opportunistic feeders, or carrying some risk of exposure through ingestion of infected tissue, even though the precise transmission dynamics in wild scavenger populations remain incompletely understood. This is the part of the aerial cull footage that almost never makes it into the highlight reel because it happens after the cameras stop rolling and the helicopter has already left the property. Across the hours and days that follow a large removal event, scavenger activity around the carcass sites increases sharply and predictably. Vultures circling and descending in growing numbers, drawn by a concentrated, sudden surplus of carrion that would not naturally occur at this density or this frequency, anywhere in the existing food web. It is, functionally, an artificial and recurring nutrient pulse, injected into the landscape by human intervention on a schedule that has no equivalent in the natural feeding patterns these scavenger populations evolved around. What it means for disease transmission risk within local scavenger communities, over years of repeated exposure to a recurring supply of potentially infected carrion, is a question that wildlife health researchers have only begun to seriously study, even as the practice generating that exposure has expanded into a multi-million-dollar tourism industry operating largely without coordinated public health monitoring of its downstream ecological effects. And then there is the third part of the aftermath, the part that is, against every expectation set up by footage of helicopters and machine guns, genuinely, measurably positive. Because removing feral hogs from a watershed, even temporarily, even without solving the larger statewide population crisis, produces a real and rapid improvement in one specific, easily measured outcome: water quality. The feral hogs wallow directly in creeks, ponds, and other water sources, and their waste, combined with the sediment disturbance from their rooting behavior along stream banks, introduces significant bacterial contamination into the watersheds they occupy. In a multi-year removal program conducted in the Plum Creek watershed across Caldwell and Hayes counties, Texas Wildlife Services personnel removed 537 feral hogs over a 2-year period. When researchers compared bacteria levels in that section of the creek against an adjacent comparable area where feral hog populations remained high, they found the treated section showed a 48% reduction in overall bacterial contamination. That is not a marginal statistical artifact. It is a substantial, directly measurable improvement in water quality, achieved specifically and exclusively through the physical removal of feral hogs from the watershed, with no other intervention required. This is the genuinely unexpected shape of the full picture once you assemble all 3 pieces of it. The footage of an aerial cull viewed alone looks like total victory, overwhelming force applied against a clearly defined enemy, resulting in dramatic, visible, immediate results. The state-level population data tells a very different story, an industry killing tens of thousands of animals annually, deploying helicopters, machine guns, thermal imaging, and a substantial tourism economy built specifically around the activity, and still falling roughly 40 percentage points short of the harvest rate required just to prevent the population from continuing to grow. The disease ecology data adds a layer that almost never appears in the footage at all, a recurring artificial surge of carrion moving through the local food web after every major removal event, carrying a meaningfully elevated risk of pseudorabies and brucellosis exposure into scavenger and predator populations, whose long-term health consequences from this exposure pattern remain genuinely understudied. And the water quality data shows that, despite all of that complexity, the underlying logic of removal is not pointless. It produces concrete, measurable ecological benefit at the local and watershed level, even when it accomplishes almost nothing towards solving the larger, statewide population crisis that triggered the cull in the first place. None of these 3 findings cancels out the others. They sit together uncomfortably as the actual aftermath of footage that, taken on its own, was never built to convey any of this complexity. A massacre that doesn't reduce the population it targets, carcasses that become a recurring, unmonitored vector for disease moving through the surrounding ecosystem, and a real, measurable local environmental benefit that survives despite all of it. Texas is not winning its war against feral hogs by any standard the population data supports. It is, at best, fighting an extraordinarily expensive, partially self-defeating holding action, one that happens to look, on camera, exactly like total victory every single time the footage gets uploaded. The helicopters will fly again tomorrow. The population statewide will very likely be larger by this time next year than it is today, regardless of how many sorties are flown or how many carcasses are left scattered across the brush between now and then. And somewhere out past the edge of where the cameras were pointed, the scavengers are already circling. Subscribe. Because the real story in that footage was never really about the hogs.